Good morning, class. Nice to see you again. So today, as I promised you, I thought it would be useful to have a review session. And I thought that would be useful for several reasons. One is, of course, because you have a final exam coming up, and I thought it would be useful just to go over stuff so that you have an idea of what to expect, and you have a chance to ask me questions in a setting where, of course, when I answer you, everyone gets to hear the answer. So it has positive knowledge spillovers. And second, because learning macroeconomics is quite challenging. We're trying to get a picture of how it is that an overall economy functions. And of course, the overall economy has lots of moving parts that fit together. But when we're in class learning something, just because that's the way the universe works, we have to do it in sequence. And we have to try and choose what's a sensible sequence in which to try and do this. And at the end, as a result, I think it's useful to just sit down and try and put together this whole big picture, put together all the pieces of the puzzle that make up the macroeconomy. Okay? So you'll recall that we started the semester by defining what it is that macroeconomics is about, and it is the study of economic aggregates. And so we started by familiarizing ourselves with a certain list of economic aggregates. And then actually later in the semester we supplemented that list with a few more. So the first, of course, was GDP, gross domestic product. And you should know this definition so well that if aliens abduct you at 3 a.m. and force you to tell them what GDP is, you should be able to do it without trouble. So, of course, GDP is total production of final goods and services produced in a particular place over a particular period of time. And GDP comes in two varieties. One is nominal GDP, where the market prices we're using are the prices of the particular period of time that we have in mind. And then we have real GDP, which is measured using market prices from a base year. And of course, we do that because nominal GDP is mixing changes in prices and quantities. In macroeconomics, we're often interested in how something is changing over time. And if we want to understand how production is changing over time, we need to take out somehow the influence of prices. Now, this distinction between nominal and real variables comes up again later. It comes up again in two key places. One place where the distinction between nominal and real comes up that's very important is wages. So there is nominal wages, which is just the number of dollars you're paid for a unit of work. But then there are real wages, which, well, on the one hand, literally, the real wage is the real wage measured in dollars from some base year. What are we doing when we're measuring real wages? We're adjusting the wages for inflation. That's what ultimately is the difference between nominal anything and real anything. One is adjusted for inflation. What's the other context where this distinction matters? Interest rates. Real interest rates are nominal interest rates adjusted for inflation. The nominal rate is the amount of extra dollars you have to, the nominal interest rate is the number of extra cents you have to pay for any dollar that you borrow. The real interest rate adjusts that for inflation. Okay? So this nominal and real distinction comes up elsewhere. It comes up with wages, and it comes up with interest rates. So having taken GDP and adjusted it for inflation, that means that, of course, we can try and, well, it implies that we must have some way of measuring what prices are doing themselves. And any such measure of what prices are on aggregates, we call the price level. And you'll remember there are several ways of measuring prices. There's one called the GDP deflator, which is based on measuring the gap here between nominal and real GDP. But more commonly used measures of the price level are the CPI, which is measured by taking some basket of typical goods that we consume and tracking its cost over time. And then there's a PPI, which does the same for a basket of goods produced. And so we can use those to measure what prices are doing. And typically when we think about prices changing, we refer to the inflation rate, which is of course nothing but the growth rate of this thing, the growth rate of the price. There were other aggregates that we talked about. Immediately after talking about the price level, we talked about various aggregates to do with the labor market, and the one that we spend most time talking about is probably the unemployment rate. And later on, I guess shortly before midterm one, I think, we talked about certain monetary aggregates. And the key monetary aggregates that we worried about were the money supply, which is just a measure of the quantity of money. And another monetary aggregate we worried about was the monetary base, which is the sum of currency plus reserve accounts. And what is the monetary base? It's just what the Fed uses to pay for things. So that came up later, but just put it here now on our list of aggregates that you need to keep in mind. Then, what did we do? We looked at what real GDP, actually real GDP per person, does over time. Actually, I've written this wrong, because if I want to track something over time, we'll always have time over here. And you'll remember that if you look at real GDP over time in most places, you end up with a graph that looks something like this. Where you see two phenomena. First, over long periods of time, you observe that real GDP per capita goes up. And we call that phenomenon economic growth. But around that sort of long-run trend, which is represented by the green line, you see that the economy is sometimes growing a bit faster, sometimes a bit slower, sometimes much slower, sometimes much faster. And so these movements around that trend, we think of as what we call the business cycle. And so traditionally, macroeconomics has been divided in two. On the one hand, the idea is that we need to try and understand why long-run economic growth happens, on the one hand, and on the other hand, into the study of why is it that the economy fluctuates around that trend. And that's how our class was structured as well. We started by, after having defined our main aggregates, we started by then spending a couple of weeks talking about economic growth. When we were done with that, we then spent the rest of the semester thinking about business cycles. So to me, understanding economic growth is very important because, as you saw, there are tremendous differences in real GDP per capita across space, across different places. And that means there are tremendous differences in economic welfare across places. And so that's something that motivated me to study economics in the first place. But the business cycle is also non-trivial because, when the economy, like think about here, which if you'll remember, this is the Great Depression. This graph is real. And of course, the Great Depression hit a lot of people very hard. Right? It was had huge negative economic impact on a large number of people, and so that's why the business cycle is also important. And it's important both because we want to understand why it happens and because we want to know if there's anything we, or I guess to be more precise, the government can do to try and either avoid situations like this or at least manage them so that they're not too damaging. And that's what we spent most of the semester talking about. So we turned to economic growth and we came up with this idea that real GDP, so all the final goods and services out there, are produced by having a whole bunch of inputs that are then combined using a collection of procedures that we summarized under the term technology. Remember? And this sort of sketch of how production works we call the production function. And what we observed was, well, we used this little sketch to come up with two ideas that were very important. The first idea was to spend time thinking about exactly what is involved in this combination process. What is technology? And we came up with several ideas. One is that naturally the combination of objects into making new, I guess, more complex products, of course, involves some science and engineering knowledge. So part of the productive process is a science and engineering knowledge that goes into combining, I don't know, silicon and plastic and steel and whatever it is into making final products. But remembering that what's 2/3 of GDP? Labor. So a lot of this combination process doesn't involve combining objects, it involves combining people. Of course, it's the people who are combining the objects too. So that means that we don't just need to know how to manage objects in space and time, we also need to know how to manage teams of people. So the management or organizational knowledge involved in that should also be an important determinant of how efficiently we can combine inputs into making outputs. And finally, there's more, because these ideas, the science and the management, come from thinking about sort of the day-to-day activity of actually combining things into making objects. But that process of combining things into objects depends on the bigger picture, by which I mean, there's some rules regulating what you can and can't do, rules that affect what I can and cannot do in teams. Can I enslave my workers or beat them up or not? Those things matter for the process of production. And is a certain activity illegal or not? Are monopolies outlawed? The list is endless, right, of the different regulations and laws that constrain or enable productive activity. Is the government corrupt so I can actually get away with some of those things as long as I bribe the right person? Right? All of that we lumped together into the broad term institutions. That was the first thing we did with this sketch. The second thing we did with this sketch, in the context of economic growth, was to think about this idea that has been there since the beginning when you took micro, which was the idea of decreasing marginal returns. If this production function is characterized by decreasing returns to inputs, it means that the only way we could possibly have economic growth over decades and decades and decades, I'd say centuries, is if technology is continuously improving. What's the alternative? The alternative would be that we're growing because of the accumulation of inputs. That can't be because of decreasing returns. We would be winding down our growth. It would be slowing and slowing and slowing, and then eventually it wouldn't be worth investing in more inputs, and so we'd stop. So the only reason we can have growth is because there's technical progress. That's a powerful conclusion from a simple idea. What did we do then? We used that idea further, not just to think about how economic growth occurs over time, but I guess what it had, that's a logical conclusion we reached, but it has implications that are testable. That's what I wanted to say. So, for example, what it suggests is that if countries have a similar technology, then they should converge. And which, alternatively, if you have a country, maybe the best test of this is if you have a country that for some reason, or an economy that experiences some sort of destructive event that ruins some chunk of the capital stock, whether it's a war or a hurricane or an earthquake, what should you see happen next? Well, you've just damaged the capital, but the technology is the same, right? So it should grow super fast and recover quickly. And then if you look far enough ahead, it'll be as though nothing happened. And we see that. What else does it predict? It predicts that if you see that countries aren't converging, logically, it must be that they have different technology. And given that, let's say, let's think about science. I'm sure that a mechanical engineering class here at GW is very similar to a mechanical engineering class in Peru. So I don't think it's the science that varies much from place to place. It must be something else that is behind large, persistent differences across countries in real GDP. There must be some places where the institutions are able to encourage or at least not get in the way of productive activity, and other places where, for whatever reason, the institutions are not encouraging or are getting in the way of productive activity. We discussed a bunch of possible examples. All right, any questions or comments about our growth discussion? All right, so then we turned to the discussion of the business cycle, but before we did that, we had to pause. And the reason we had to pause before we talked about the business cycle was because we needed a few more things to add to our, I guess, we needed a few more pieces that we needed to fit into the business cycle puzzle. And the reason is because, as we saw, it is difficult to talk about the business cycle, and it's difficult to talk about stabilization policy if we don't know something about how the financial system works. So we came up with the financial system when we were talking about growth because we were saying, well, you could think of the financial or the sort of overall development of the financial system as one of the institutions that might encourage or discourage growth. But then to think about the business cycle, we actually have to look at the financial system more carefully. And we actually did that in two ways. The first way I'll tell you about now, we saw, I think it was just before the first midterm, and that was through the window of the bank balance sheet. And we looked at bank balance sheets for several reasons. One was because it's useful on its own to know a little bit about balance sheets. We spent a few weeks talking about balance sheets. One thing that you have learned by doing that is that you have had a sort of short crash course in financial accounting. Those of you in the business school will obviously do more of it, but those of you who aren't, this knowledge is actually useful on its own. The other reason, or another reason, was because this was also an opportunity for you to learn something about finance. This was also a sort of mini crash course in finance, as we'll get to in a bit. And finally, this was also a window into understanding how it is that problems in the financial sector can actually spill over and lead to problems in the macroeconomy overall. And also, it was a window into seeing how it is that monetary policy works. When the Fed is trying to deal with the macroeconomic fallout from some shock, the way they do it is usually by doing something or other with the banks. That's who the Fed interacts with mostly. And so to understand how monetary policy works, we also needed to have in mind how balance sheets function. So I remember when I was an undergraduate student in my macro class, my first macro class, I didn't really understand why the professor was talking about balance sheets. But there are actually lots of reasons why. It's valuable information on its own, and it's essential to understanding how financial shocks hit the macroeconomy, and it's essential for understanding how monetary policy works. So lots of reasons. Okay? And let's see. Before moving on to our more core discussion of the business cycle, I guess I'll say two more things about business balance sheets. One is that this was also an opportunity to think about different kinds of financial assets that are out there. Again, knowledge that I think is of independent usefulness to you, aside from how it fits into our macroeconomics class. Because, of course, we all know banks' main business is to lend funds to people for starting businesses, for buying houses, for whatever purpose. But banks also hold securities, and the securities are sort of kind of like fancy loans. But that's not obvious until you think about what the securities actually are. So we talked about two kinds of securities that banks might, or that you and I actually might own. You can go buy securities if you feel like it. And one was bonds, which is very important. It's going to come up over and over as we talk today. And bonds are really like loans. For a loan, you are, let's say you're lending to me, you're giving me P dollars now in exchange for me paying you back F dollars in the future. That difference is the interest. If I scale it by the size of the loan you gave me, that's telling me how much you're paying, or how much I'm paying you per dollar that I borrowed. That's, of course, the nominal interest rate. That's for a loan. A bond actually achieves the same thing. A bond is a contract that says, I promise to pay you $100,000 next year. I sell that contract to you for some price. The price that you're paying me for this future payment is the same as a loan, right? You're giving me money now in exchange for 100,000 in the future. So then this F is 100,000 and the P is whatever you agreed to pay me. So it's just like a loan. So bonds are one kind of securities. The difference, of course, between a bond and a loan is that if you make me a loan of $100,000, we're tied together and you have to wait for next year when I pay you back. Whereas if I sell you a bond and you're paying me up front, if you decide, you know what, I don't want to wait until next year, you can try and resell that contract to someone else for, well, whatever it is that it's worth at the time. So there's an extra convenience to you as a lender of having this bond instead of a loan, and anything like that, the financial transaction, well, financial asset, a promise of future payment for which there is this resale market, that's a security. And if you take 2121, Econ 2121, you'll see that there's this thing called securitization, which is where someone who has an asset figures out how to make a contract out of it that they can then resell and not be stuck with it, so to speak. So bonds are one kind of security. The other kind of security we talked about are shares. That's a bit different. In the case of a bond, there is this face value, this fixed amount, this future quantity F that I'm promising you. In the case of shares, it's a promise of future payment based on the profitability of the enterprise. So it's almost like a stake of ownership in the enterprise. And so, of course, the value of a share is going to be connected to how much or how little you expect this firm to generate in profits. Not today, but over the entire lifetime of the company, because this document, this contract, is an entitlement to, let's say, 1% of the profits now and forever of this company. And so its value should fluctuate based on information about this enterprise's profitability. If you were to take Econ 2121 with me, I would we spent, I think, a day or two, maybe 45 minutes talking about securities, maybe a day. If you were in 2121, we'd spend a month discussing different kinds of assets that are out there. Because there are a lot of other things. There are derivatives. Let's see, what assets did I mention at some point in class? I mentioned mortgage-backed securities. Remember what happens there? A lot of these loans are mortgages for people to buy houses. The banks can then package together all the interest payments that someone might make in the future on those mortgages and sell that. So they figured out a way to securitize mortgages. Those are mortgage-backed securities. What else are there? There's something called credit default swaps, which is basically a payment you get if someone defaults. So what is it? It's an insurance contract against someone's default. If credit default swaps prices go up, what does it mean? It means that insurance is more valuable. It means you're more worried about someone defaulting. Guess what's happening to the price of credit default swaps right now? They're going up. So, anyhow, the point is, because these securities are traded, their value may change over time. The loans are just loans, right? You made the loan to someone, you're waiting for them to repay you. Although they could default. If they default, that would be a problem. But the securities are constantly gaining or losing value because, well, they're securities. They vary based on the costs or benefits of alternative assets. They vary based on information you have about risk and so on. And one thing that might make the value of securities fluctuate, which I want to point out to you. You'll remember this, but I want to reiterate it because it's always something that people remember but don't remember why. Is that one of the things that might affect the value of securities is, bless you, interest rates. Observe the following, and in particular, I guess, the value of bonds. I can distribute 1 over P across the F and the P, right? This is the same equation. What's P divided by P? As long as P isn't 0, which it isn't. 1. So when interest rates rise, what happens to bond prices? They go down. So there are many factors why the values of securities might rise and fall. One of them is interest rates. Whenever the value of securities rises or falls, and this is important, that necessarily is reflected in the bank capital. Because the key underlying this balance sheet is that even though there are two sides to it, there are assets and liabilities, there's only one pile of funds, which is the assets, and they have a certain value. What are the liabilities? Well, these are the list of the bank's commitments to other people that it would pay using these assets. They're the deposits that belong to people like you and me who have an account there. The borrowings, which have to do with loans this bank itself took out from other banks or from the Fed. And what's bank capital? Bank capital is what's left over. What's left over for whom? What's left over for the owners. So when the value of these assets rises and falls, that's the bank capital, what's left over for the owners, rising and falling. And that's fine, right? It's fine for the owners of businesses to face the business risk involved in their operations. But the concern is what happens if something happens to the value of the securities that dramatically lowers their value. Actually, dramatically lowers their value. It should be a downward arrow, right? Well, that would dramatically lower the value of the capital. And the capital isn't infinite, so it means that any bank at any moment in time faces some risk, or some exposure, I guess, to the securities going down in value so much that the bank capital actually goes to 0 or even becomes negative. What does that mean? It means that the value of these assets is not enough to cover all its obligations to other people, to other entities. And again, this is not hypothetical. This happened this semester several times to multiple banks. And again, that's why I spend a lot of time talking about balance sheets in this class. It's because the risk is real, it's there, and it's actually materializing now of bank runs. And if there are bank runs happening, it means that one thing we and the Fed has to worry about is the possibility of a banking crisis. Yes?
Just trying to confirm, if the interest rate goes up, the price of the securities go up as well?
If the interest rate goes up, remember, this is a bond, so it's a promise of future repayment. I committed to paying you $100,000. If the interest rate goes up, it's the same thing as saying you're not willing to pay as much for that promise as you were before. So bond price goes down. Yeah. And why did I mention this? I mentioned it because this is what's happening. The Fed is raising interest rates because they're worried about inflation. We'll get back to that. But the Fed is raising interest rates, and they're doing this to all the banks. They're eroding the quality of their balance sheet. They're making them more at risk of insolvency. So this is something the Fed and we have to be concerned about. All right, let's see. We still have more than half an hour, which is good. So, yes.
How does the inflation relate to the interest rate?
We'll get there. So, well, I guess the short answer is the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. And so, if you and I have a pre-existing fixed contract, then higher inflation means that I end up paying you lower real interest. That's one relationship. The second relationship we didn't actually spend much time on in class, but it's true, which is that if you and I know that inflation is going to be high, that was to do with a pre-existing contract that we'd already agreed, and there was inflation that was different from what we anticipated. On the other hand, if you anticipate high inflation, what are you going to do? If I come to you and I say, can you please lend me money? You think there's going to be high inflation, what are you going to do? You're going to charge me higher interest to compensate you for the inflation on any new contracts, right? So that's something called the Fisher equation, but we didn't spend much time on it. This, of course, is just the definition of the real interest rate. So you should remember that. This turns out to have two uses. Our main use was, this means that if inflation is greater than what you anticipated when you lent money to someone, in real terms, you end up on the losing end. On the other hand, of course, if you're a borrower and inflation ends up being higher than you anticipated, that's great, because what you're repaying is smaller in real terms. Great. So, most of our class we spent thinking about the business cycle, and our discussion of the business cycle was entirely happening in this space, right, in these axes. We spent most of the semester thinking about how supply and demand might work, not in the micro world that you saw in the past, but in the macro world. And of course, that means that price in this context would mean price level, and quantity in this context would mean real GDP. So we started off by doing this with the supply, and the observation was that when the price level changes, if all prices move together, then the incentives to do anything versus an alternative doesn't actually change. Like if you increase the price of everything by 10%, then in real terms, so to speak, everything is still the same as it was before. So we called that the long run and used it to come up with this idea of the long run aggregate supply that doesn't depend on prices, because we think in the long run everything balances out and all prices move together. But that suggests that there's something else called the short run, and in the short run it must be therefore that some price isn't moving with all the other ones. And which is that price? That was, of course, the sticky wage. And so the idea was that whenever anything happens that actually changes prices, it takes the wage a long time to adapt to that change, because labor markets are full of frictions. It takes a long time to renegotiate wage contracts. When you make new wage contracts, the budget maybe had to be made in advance as well, and so wages don't respond very quickly to changes. And that's how we came up with the short run aggregate supply curve, which embodies that idea. So when prices change, let's say prices rise, wages don't rise, what did you just do? You just made a greater reward to production without raising the costs. So higher prices, more production. Yes?
You said it's possible to raise the price level simultaneously, so it doesn't really have an effect on everything?
Right. So I guess we're going to come back to that, but what we did after the second midterm was discuss the idea that saying that prices are sticky, what we're really saying is that prices are set in advance. Of course, they're set in advance based on whatever we think is going to be happening over the time when the contract is hard to renegotiate. And one of the key things that we would want to have in mind when negotiating a wage contract is expected inflation. So in reality, we would have a supply curve that's moving up along with expected inflation, but as long as your forecast of inflation is correct, it doesn't matter. And so then you never leave this long run curve.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask, is it like possible to raise the price level so high that it affects exports to other countries?
So that's a question about demand, not so much supply. So, which is the next thing. So aggregate demand is a relationship between what people want to buy and the price level. And our discussion of aggregate demand, our discussion of aggregate supply, I think, took 2 classes. Our discussion of aggregate demand took many more. And the reason was because aggregate demand has many parts. And each of these parts basically has its own chapter, almost. So the overall workings of this is discussed in chapter 10 and 12, I guess. But investment is discussed, has an entire chapter, it's chapter 7. Government spending comes up in chapter 7 and chapter 13. And exports minus imports has chapter 9. So we are going in sort of a linear fashion, saying, okay, let's talk about supply, let's talk about demand, but then to dig deep into how aggregate demand works, we had to go through all this other material. Yes?
So is there somewhere like the average worker, consumer can find out what this would be for the United States, for example, or like what inflation is for the United States?
If I wanted to know so there's 2 things. So the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, publishes inflation numbers regularly. Of course, that's backward looking. It's measuring the inflation that already happened. If you want a forecast of inflation, the way I would do it is I would open the Wall Street Journal and compare the interest rates on US government bonds to something called TIPS, which are inflation-adjusted bonds. So since one of them is compensating you for inflation and the other one isn't, the gap is inflation. The gap is the forecast of inflation that the investors have. And those investors aren't idiots, and they're also putting their money where their mouth is. So I would take those forecasts fairly seriously, unless I thought that there was some bias for some reason.
Is there somewhere we can see like this, like what the average price level, or like the aggregate price level in like the GDP is, like what the goal of that is for that?
I mean, we know, so we never observe these lines, if that's what you mean, right? We're only observing the data of what's the price level, we observe the data of what's GDP. What's behind it? Well, the Fed has a huge team of economists trying to figure that out. Oh, is this a demand shock? Is this a supply shock? Is this because of what the Fed did? Is this because of something else? It's not straightforward. So, having gone through each of these, and I guess with each one we did 2 things. One is we use it to think about what's the slope of the demand curve, and we basically ended up with the demand curve having a downward slope because when the price level rises, it erodes the real value of your savings. So you can't afford as much, and that's why it slopes down. And we also used it as an opportunity to think of different factors that might move the aggregate demand curve. And we came up with a very long list of factors of things that might move the demand curve. And as a result, we ended up with a theory of the business cycle that's based on any of these numerous factors changing in an unexpected way. Let's say, for example, the easiest example is always suppose income abroad goes down. And so let's say the European economy contracts because they put sanctions on imports of Russian energy products, which of course leads their economies to contract. That means that US exports to their trading partners would go down because they can't afford as much. And you get this unanticipated shift in the demand curve, which opens a recessionary gap. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is, given that among the long list of factors that affects the demand curve, we have several that are actually under government control, is there something the government can do to try and manage this situation? So that comes under the broad heading of stabilization policy. And stabilization policy comes in two varieties. One was fiscal policy, which is directly under the control of the government. It involves the government using its power over government spending, or its power over taxes, or its power over transfers to try and influence spending. You'll remember Professor Steve Hamilton talking about stimulus checks. That's where this ends up. And that was all covered in chapter 13, I think mainly 13.4. And then there is monetary policy. That isn't under the government's direct control, rather that's under the power of the Fed. And generally we think of that being the Fed's power over interest rates. But we also we actually spent the whole day discussing that there are various channels of monetary policy, various ways in which what the Fed does can affect aggregates, including, of course, it's just power over the availability of credit to the banking system. So I want to spell out both of those here. And what's the idea? The idea is that by stimulating spending, the government could try and push the demand curve back where it came from. By raising government spending, cutting taxes, or raising transfers, or in this case, by lowering interest rates, which makes it cheaper to borrow, and thus easier to spend, or by increasing the monetary base, which makes credit more available. Okay? So, let me see. What can I add here? One thing that I didn't mention here, which I think might be worth going over, because I think it helps to tie a lot of what's up here on the board together, is that when we talked about investments, we observed that if you think carefully about how investors determine investments, it's difficult to entirely separate it from the decision of someone thinking about buying some sort of financial asset. They're both very similar decisions because in both cases you have a person who has some funds that they're deciding not to use to consume right now. If you're contemplating buying a financial asset, well, you're deciding whether or not to put funds aside in order for a lender to repay you later. But if you're thinking of buying an investment good, that's actually the same thing. It's just that you're investing in building a venture of some kind or expanding a venture in return for future income. And so that means that the trade-off of whether or not to invest and the trade-off of whether or not to buy financial assets is very close. And we represented that idea in a different figure, which is what Chapter 7 is all about, which was the market for loanable funds, where the decisions to buy and sell assets and the decisions to invest in, I guess, productive physical assets, capital, interact. And the way they interacted was that, well, first of all, I have to write some price concept here. What's the price of borrowing $1? Well, it's the interest rate, and if we want to be careful, it's the real interest rate, because ultimately that's what you care about. You don't eat dollars, you eat the food you buy with the dollars. So it's the real interest rate that matters. There is some demand for loanable funds, that's the borrowers, some of which might be you and me borrowing to buy consumer goods, like credit card debt, but much of it is going to be borrowing to finance business ventures. And then where's the supply of funds coming from? The supply of funds is coming from, I guess, 3 different places. Broadly, the supply of loanable funds is coming again from someone who is setting aside money and either handing it to someone else to finance some sort of venture or using it themselves to finance some sort of venture. So that's savings. But savings on its own is not sufficient to get to the demanders. Because let's say I save by putting my money in deposits at my account at my credit union. Does that result in loans? Not directly. It will only result in loans to the extent that the bank decides to take those deposits and lend them out. In other words, this bank is here making the supply meet the demand. So one factor that affects where this supply is our savings. Another factor that affects the supply here is what are the banks doing? Are the banks lending the funds that we give them or not? And why does that matter? It matters because the banks, they have their day-to-day operations. But as we were discussing, there are times when the banks suddenly decide they don't want to lend, when they're particularly worried about bank runs, which they are now. And how's that going to show up here? Well, if we give our savings to the banks, but the banks decide they're afraid and they don't want to lend them, that's even without a change in our behavior, the behavior of the savers, that might still result in a decrease in the supply of funds to this market. And of course, what does that do? It does 2 things. It raises rates and it lowers loanable funds, which means it lowers spending. So the easy example for how to get a recessionary gap opening is something like, well, income abroad changed, and that just sucks, that's too bad. But things happening here in the loanable funds market can also make things go bad here. And you could probably intuit this without me having to draw this figure, right? Just banks aren't lending, therefore people can't borrow, therefore their spending declines. We didn't need all this to do that, but this is a sort of more formal way of representing it. Another example. What if, some of these, among these savers, people who are supplying loanable funds to United States financial markets, are foreign entities who decide that they're going to buy US assets. What if, for example, the government of Indonesia decides that it doesn't want to hold its currency reserves in dollars anymore? Why did I mention that? because that happened yesterday. They started dealing with South Korean government in local currencies rather than using dollars. So they don't need as many dollars. Well, what if people don't want dollars anymore around the world? Regardless of what's happening here. Same thing, less supply. Same thing here. So the usefulness of this is also it reminds us that things that happen outside this economy could then influence it. One is because of what's happening with net exports, but also what's happening with financial flows. All right, let's see. What else have I failed to discuss here? There's one more thing that I think is worth mentioning, and that is that even though there's so many different things that might buffet the demand curve, therefore leading us to this idea that the business cycle is largely driven by demand shocks, it is nonetheless possible, occasionally, for there to be supply shocks. Yes? So the idea is just that anything that happens in the loanable funds market that changes the equilibrium amounts of loanable funds is therefore having an impact on spending. If it increases equilibrium loanable funds, it probably means there's more spending. But if it decreases it, it means there's less because, this is what, if we can borrow, then that's limiting certain amount of spending. Yeah, that's right. It makes investments and consumption go down in this example. So the last thing I wanted to remind you of was that even though demand shocks may be responsible for most business cycle movements, there can occasionally be supply shocks. For example, as I just mentioned, what's happening in Europe right now, in Britain, let's say. Britain suddenly has access to far less and far more expensive energy resources than it did a year and a half ago. My brother lives in the UK. He tells me that his heating bill has quadrupled. That's a dramatic increase in input prices. How does that show up here? That shows up as a supply shock. And the key about supply shocks is that it puts regulators like the Fed in a tight spot because they have to decide whether to respond to this, and if so, how. And the problem is the Fed can control the supply curve only indirectly. The Fed can control a supply curve because one reason the supply curve might move is because wages increased because we expected high inflation. But that's not something the Fed can change on a day-to-day basis. The only thing the Fed can change on a day-to-day basis through monetary policy is the demand curve. And, well, since it's the supply curve that moved and they don't have any power to move it back, if they want to do anything in this situation, they have to choose. Are they going to try and keep inflation low? If they do, they would be raising rates. Right? They would have to get the price level down to where it would have been otherwise. But if you're doing that, you're making you're making the recessionary gap much bigger. On the other hand, if you do the opposite and instead you decide to fight the recessionary gap by lowering interest rates, sure, you may have lowered the recessionary gap, made it smaller, but you've also added to the inflation, which means that you, me, the general public, should expect much higher inflation later on. And if you expect higher inflation, what does it do? It's another supply shock. So you can either fight the supply shock now, make matters worse in the short run, or not fight it, but then you're just creating an inflationary spiral. And so there's sort of no easy way out when there are supply shocks. And I mention this because it seems like we are in an era where we've experienced many supply shocks. And how is the Fed dealing with it? Well, a year ago, the way the Fed dealt with rising inflation was by saying, I don't know if you're listening to what the Fed was saying at the time, you might not have, but the Fed was saying, it's temporary, right? When there's a supply shock, what's the best thing that could happen? It just goes away and you don't have to deal with it anymore. And that's what the Fed was saying. It's temporary, don't worry. What are they really saying when they tell you it's temporary? They're saying, please don't expect higher inflation. Was it temporary? No. At least it's still ongoing, although I guess inflation has been coming down, but if you have high inflation for a year, I don't know if I'd call that, and it's still not going down, I don't know if I'd call that temporary. So, all right, any questions about anything that's on the board, or anything that you think maybe, or that you thought I might talk about, but that isn't on the board? No? All right, then it is time for your final exit quiz. And while you're logging in, I want to tell you that it's been the hardest semester of my life, I think, because, well, just the number of students and various other things that I had to do that didn't have to do with this class, but at the same time, I also like to say it's been a pleasure to get to know you, to talk to you, and I hope you learned something useful by attending this class. And if you ever want to discuss anything with me about economics or anything else, you know where to find me. So thank you. All right, I guess we still have a few people coming in, so let's wait a little longer. Caring Swan. All right, let's get started. Question 1. This is a poll. What do you think of this class? Let's see. Interesting and challenging. Glad to hear it. Where did I grow up? The answer, of course, is Peru. Glad you're paying attention. Next, as a generalization, what can we say about growth and the business cycle? Of course, the answer is growth is due to technical progress and the business cycle is due to market imbalances. Market imbalances are due to a mismatch between what? Of course, the answer is expectations and reality. According to Professor Samaniego, what can happen if expected inflation rises too much? Real GDP goes down. data suggests that all countries share the same technology. True or false? Where technology is defined as on the board. Of course, the answer is false. There are huge differences in GDP per capita. Next, which of these is not part of technology as we defined it? The answer is oil. That's a resource. And finally, who is the chair of the Fed? Of course, the answer is Jerome Powell. All right, let's see how we did in our last Kahoot. Macy is third, good job. Second is So. And first is Harry. Good job, everyone, especially Harry. I have a little something for you if you want. So everyone else, nice to see you. See you in office hours or around campus and in your exam. Take care.